The art of DMing is a beautiful and continuous pursuit, and we all have something to learn. If you're wanting to keep your players coming back for more in your D&D games, make sure to avoid the 10 mistakes we discuss in this video. Stick around to the end for some great advice and to learn which of these mistakes I make in my games. Like all the time, I'm terrible for it. Okay, let's go. Choice is a central component of the role-playing experience. A large part of the reason that many of us play is because we get the choice to be someone different and do different things to what we do in our daily lives. This is why you shouldn't railroad your players. If you haven't come across the term before, railroading is forcing something to happen. Typically, we use it to refer to things that are forced to happen in the plot, for example, forced scenarios or forced outcomes. Imagine there's an encounter with a big bad evil guy and he's summoning a demon. An example of railroading would be giving the big bad evil guy plot armor so he can't die or be incapacitated until he's finished his summoning ritual. Methods to do this can be more or less obvious, and in some cases a little railroading is okay. Let's discuss. If the DM secretly gives the opponent more hit points to ensure that the ritual happens, and that makes the encounter more interesting as a result, then that's probably fine. But if, for example, a player casts banishment on the big bad evil guy and he visibly fails his save, yet doesn't get banished, that's pretty obvious railroading and should be avoided. Really consider the pros and cons of any decision you make that contradicts either the rules of the game, the fundamental laws of the game world, or logic, because it can leave players not trusting the game world or its rules arbiter, you, the DM. I was playing in a game recently and it felt like the entire plot was a railroad experience. The introduction seemed forced and on a timer. It didn't seem to matter what the party did until a set point in time at which something was forced to happen and we couldn't stop it. We then had to chase the guy that did the thing, and we were told that the guy was faster than us and we couldn't catch up with them, with no explanation as to why. In the final part of the session, after I went through a door into a building, then turned around to try and open the door again, I was told it was magically sealed shut with no plausible explanation as to why. Personally, fog walls work for me in Souls games, but not in D&D. Don't be like that DM, and I guarantee that your players will feel much more like they belong in your game and at your table. This next one is the flip side of the last mistake. Don't limit your players unless you have a good reason to. I love role-playing video games. These days titles like Baldur's Gate 3 have amazing graphics and gameplay and let players explore fantastic worlds and go on epic quests. But even so, they still fall short of a good session at the table for me. Why is that? Well, it comes down to choice again, and it's because even though a company like Larian Studios spends huge amounts of money trying to, they can't program every possible decision a player might make into a game. In D&D, your imagination is the only limit. So whatever wacky ideas a player might have, if it's in keeping with the fundamental laws of the game world that you're playing in, and doesn't lead to a poorer experience for the rest of the party, a good DM should almost always let a player explore those ideas. Action should have consequences, of course, and many ideas a player may have may not have the effect that they were hoping for, or be good for the player or the party, but it's important to give your players the choice, even if it ends badly. Otherwise, we might as well just play games like Baldur's Gate 3. When you start DMing, you quickly find out that you can't account for all of the possible ways that players might interact with the content you create. I've always run custom games in D&D and I've never used a module. When I first started DMing, I would spend hours and hours planning complex adventures and dungeons with branching paths, writing down different skill checks that the party may make or ways that they might interact with different challenges, and building interesting encounters. In a way, most of that time was wasted because the party didn't interact with most of the content. These days I spend very little time at all preparing for a session, typically a couple of hours or less, starting a day or so before the session. This doesn't only save valuable time, but it makes it much less likely that I'll feel tempted to railroad the party. If I've spent hours building a side quest, then I'll probably want to try and convince the party to go on that quest. If I instead spent much less time outlining 5 different quests that the party could go on, then I can offer the party the chance to choose which quest they want to pursue. The mistake here is over-preparing, but what that means depends on you. A helpful tip here is to not prepare anything in detail more than a session in advance. If you reach the end of a quest or arc, outline the choices your players have at the end of a session and ask them what they want to pursue next. Then prepare just what you need for the next session based on the party's choices. There are a lot of rules in D&D. Some people like them and like following them, while others would prefer things to be a little looser. You're likely to have players that fall in both camps in your games. Whether you like the rules or not, the structure that they provide can be one of your best friends as a DM. The rules help provide an even footing for all players and avoid balance issues that could leave some players feeling left out of the game. Don't expect your players to get the rules right. Keep an eye out for your players misinterpreting the rules, and if something seems powerful, feel free to question it. This can go for anything, including bonuses a player is adding to their rolls, class or feature abilities, or spell effects. A great example here is Wild Shape. I've been in multiple games run by DMs that accepted a player's understanding of the Wild Shape feature without questioning it, and allowed player characters to shift into creatures with a challenge rating almost equal to their character level. This is obviously imbalanced, as it allows that single character to likely be able to solo the encounter, leading me to wonder what the point in taking part in the first place was. Some more fundamental rules that are often forgotten or misunderstood are spell component requirements, interactions, and concentration checks. Making great games means making a great shared experience. Everyone involved will like some aspects of your games more than others, and if you aren't careful, some aspects may leave some players with a bad taste in their mouth. Don't forget to ask your players what their preferences are so you can craft the best experience for everyone. You can do this in a session 0 where you ask players about their preferences before the game properly begins, and also check in by asking players for feedback between sessions. Player preferences include fundamental things like which pronouns a person prefers to be addressed with, preferences for how a game is run, game themes, and balance of game mechanics, for example combat, role-playing, and puzzles. Understanding your players' preferences can help you improve your games and lead to a better experience for everyone. While it's all too easy to run a game in a fantasy setting because it's the done thing, you may be missing out on an even better experience if all the players around the table love sci-fi and would prefer a sci-fi setting. To have the best experience for everyone, try to balance everyone's preferences when you're planning for and running your games. If most players really love combat, but one really loves puzzles, then make sure to have lots of combats in your game, but throw a puzzle in here and there. If it's the opposite way around, it would be better to have fewer combats and more puzzles. I've put together a player preferences questionnaire that you can use to ask your players about their preferences and use in your session 0s. You can get it for free from my website, link in the description. Every person and every personality around the game table is different. Or you may have some great players that always support the game. Some players may, intentionally or otherwise, take actions that can derail the game in various ways. Players themselves or the way that players play their characters can derail your games, and it's important to curb these behaviours. Players can derail games by making inopportune comments at inappropriate times, repeatedly questioning your decisions, constantly wanting to be the centre of attention, or telling other players how they should play their characters. Player characters can derail games by taking actions that cause disruption, such as attacking or stealing from important NPCs, guards, or other party members. A typical great piece of advice is to not allow players to play characters with an evil alignment unless the whole party is on board with this. The best way to curb negative behaviours depends on the player and behaviour in question, and this could be the subject of a full video, but some advice is to consider whether it may be best to question problem behaviours publicly or privately. Make sure you remain courteous, explain the situation to the player, and address the behaviour and not the player. One of the behaviours that can derail your games is attention hogging. This deserves more explanation and leads to a mistake of its own. There are a couple of types of attention hogging players. Let's call them the friendly attention hog and the me attention hog. The friendly attention hog is just really engaged with the game and wants to play their part in it. They're probably paying attention continuously throughout the session and maybe helping other players with tactics or advice. The second, on the other hand, wants to be the hero of every story, and likely gets bored and possibly disruptive if they aren't a central part of the action. Either way, a game of D&D is a shared experience, and you shouldn't let any one player dominate your attention. The friendly attention hog sounds great. We all want our players to engage well with the game, especially if we aren't confident in the game we're running and want some continuous positive feedback and someone to drive the story forward. But it's definitely a mistake to rely too much on the engaged players and forget about the rest. Try to make sure that you engage the quieter players as well. Some methods that you can use to help you do this are using social initiative or calling out specific players or their characters to share their thoughts during the game. Some players prefer to stay on the sidelines, but you should still make sure that they're not forgotten. If you have players that tend to remain quiet during sessions, it may be helpful to ask them how they're finding the sessions and if there's anything they think you could do to improve them, such as asking for their thoughts more often. I had an experience like this in an Adventurers League game that I played recently. I always do my best to remain engaged during a session. It's just good manners. And I actively try to help the DM move the story forward when I can see that it's stalling. The DM in that game quickly picked this up, and from that point on I noticed that they looked at me a lot more than they did some of the other players. I felt really odd in this situation and found myself wishing that the DM had asked some of the quieter players for their thoughts more often. As a DM, you choose when to request roles from your players. Roles are important for bringing randomness or uncertainty to the game, but they do slow the game down, so don't ask for roles if they're not needed. If a task is trivial and can be completed in the time available without risk, it's better not to ask for a role as it just slows the game down. Likewise, if a task is impossible, don't ask for a player to roll for it. If a player rolls a 20 on the die and you tell them they failed the task, they're likely to be unhappy with the outcome. Asking for a roll is an implicit promise of potential success. And if the best result that someone can roll still fails, then why make the roll? It's much better to just state that the task isn't possible given the character's current resources or knowledge. This mistake is related to the last, and it isn't always a mistake, but it often is. In some cases, player characters may take actions that oppose or attempt to influence other player characters. This can include social interactions, such as trying to deceive, persuade, or intimidate the other player character, or physical actions, such as attempting to steal from or attack the other player character. In most cases like these, it's best not to ask for player-on-player roles or dictate outcomes. If a player character tries to deceive, persuade, or intimidate another character, it's almost never ideal to ask a player to make a skill check or dictate how a character reacts. While the rest of the game is your domain, a player's character is theirs, and dictating how they react to a situation removes player agency, which can leave players feeling violated. If a player has their character take a physical action that opposes another player character, such as attacking them, this can be a sign of potential problem behaviours that you should do your best to curb. Generally, it's a good idea to ask the player whose character is being targeted what they want to happen based on the attempt, so as to not remove player agency. There are some obvious exceptions where it is appropriate to have players roll against each other. For example, a consensual sparring match between characters, or if one player has been confused, charmed, or dominated. Okay, so this is one of those classic do as I say and not as I do pieces of advice. For any games you run that have multiple sessions, don't forget to take notes, even if they're minimal. Lots of things happen during every session. Battles can be fought, quests can be completed, and new locations and NPCs can be encountered. Some of these are easy to remember, while others aren't. Having good notes can help you maintain a sense of continuity between your games. While everyone is unlikely to forget that the party defeated the big bad evil guy and saved the world, it would be much easier to forget the name of the new NPC you introduced in the last session, or the name of the store they run. Just imagine the surprise of a player that remembers having met Percival the Quartermaster during one session, who has an identical place as Peggy the Seneschal in a future session. Make sure there are basic notes about locations, quests, and NPCs that you can refer to later to maintain that sense of continuity. You may want to ask your players to make shared notes about the game. This can be a helpful reference for both the party and you. So this is definitely the mistake that I make in my games, and I'm terrible for it. Look at my notes from my last campaign session. They're a mess. Please do as I say and not as I do, and I promise you'll not regret it. I hope you can take something from this video to improve your games. If you have any more mistakes you'd add to the list, let me know in the comments. Until next time, happy adventuring.